In 1937, Hungary was desperately trying to obtain modern armored vehicles. Their only domestic design was still in its early stages, so purchasing foreign licenses seemed to be the best option. The first such purchase was soon completed, so the army would get dozens of light tanks that received the name Toldi. In this episode, I go through the Toldi's design, its production runs, and combat experience before moving on to other, heavier models of the Royal Hungarian Army. In August 1937, there were 150 Italian-made L3 tanks available, along with a handful of outdated tanks and armored cars. However, in the same month, the Straussler V4 and the Swedish L60 light tanks were both tested by the Army with mixed results. Although the V4 offered better protection and greater firepower, the L60 was a mature design with more mobility and fewer issues. Therefore, the decision was made to purchase the license to manufacture the L60 in Hungary after certain modifications. These light tanks were to be included in the two motorized and two cavalry brigades, along with the L3 tankettes in a reconnaissance role. However, the modifications would take more time. The L60's original Madsen 20mm cannon was to be replaced with a 25mm Bofors gun, but the turret did not have enough room for that, so a domestically produced 20mm anti-tank rifle, the Swiss Solothurn S18, was used instead, along with an 8mm Gebauer machine gun, because this did not require a larger turret. The 8-liter Büssing-NAG L8V petrol engine provided 155 horsepower, which was enough to reach a maximum speed of 50 km per hour. The torsion bar suspension had to be made more reliable, ventilation was to be improved, along with the periscope. Total weight was 8.5 tons, while operational range was around 220 kilometers. The R5 radio came with a round-shaped antenna, which offered more than adequate range, but it made the tank easier to spot. Armor was thin, it varied between 13 and only 6 millimeters, so the vehicle was very vulnerable to enemy fire. Interestingly, the tank came with a steering wheel that changed the speed of the two tracks depending on its exact position. Another important detail was that the Toldi could not turn on its heel, it needed 8 meters to turn around. The motor responsible for rotating the turret had to be kept on at all times, because without it, the turret could move on its own. Nonetheless, mobility was good enough for the Army, so the vehicle was adopted as the 38M Toldi, with an initial order for 80 vehicles at a price of 110,000 penge per tank. After initial squabbles, the contract was finalized in February 1939, so Mavog and guns could start production in Budapest, but further changes had to be made. The first vehicles suffered from reliability issues, as by June 1940, 47 torsion bars broke and 16 armor plates cracked. Due to the low-quality German torsion bars and a shortage of other imported components, like the Büssing engine, the Zahnradfabrik transmission, and the Zeiss optics, the decision was made to replace these parts with domestic alternatives. This was eventually done by early 1941, so the first series, now called the Toldi 1, could be completed. The vehicles formed 4 light tank companies, participating in the mostly peaceful occupation of northern Transylvania, with 36 tanks in the 2 cavalry brigades, and the much more serious invasion of Yugoslavia with 54 tanks. During these short campaigns, engine problems, reliability issues, and inexperience caused numerous breakdowns. Already in 1940, a second contract for the delivery of another 110 light tanks was signed and awarded. This series would become the 42M Toldi, or the Toldi 2, all with domestic components and an improved R5A radio that came with a simpler antenna. Delivery was much faster this time around, completing the second series by the end of the year, increasing the total number of Toldis to 190. However, Hungary's participation in Operation Barbarossa resulted in serious losses. The quickly advancing Rapid Corps eventually lost 80% of its Toldi light tanks, although most vehicles were not lost to enemy fire, so they could still be recovered and repaired later on. At the start of the campaign, in June 1941, the two motorized and two cavalry brigades had 81 Toldi light tanks, 60 Ansaldo tankettes, and 84 Chaba armored cars. The next month, the Toldis encountered strong Soviet anti-tank fire near Khmelnytsky. During the fighting, unit commander Captain Karpaty's Toldi was hit and damaged, wounding him and killing the other two crew members. Another Toldi parked in front of his light tank, providing temporary cover, before it was knocked out, killing everybody inside. In the eventual attack, 3 Soviet anti-tank guns were destroyed, and the captain was saved. By the end of the month, 24 Soviet armored vehicles were claimed, but losses were mounting, so 14 Toldis and replacement parts had to be sent to Rapid Corps from Hungary. During the campaign, until November, 25 Toldis were damaged in combat, while 62 were lost to breakdowns. But at least the latter could be repaired once the unit returned from the front by December. At the same time, all Ansaldo tankettes were lost. These were then removed from active service. In early 1942, only 17 Toldis were operational, but this was not an immediate issue, as the Army now wanted 2 armored and 1 mechanized divisions, with Toldi light tanks for reconnaissance and Turan medium tanks for combat duties. The plan was disrupted by the German demand to send a full army to the front with 1 armored formation. With no medium tanks available in Hungary, 1st Armored Field Division received Panzer IV and Panzer 38T tanks, along with 14 Toldis, once again for reconnaissance purposes. Like most Axis units, this division suffered enormous losses, with only 3 Toldi light tanks returning to Hungary by March 1943. By then, a new version was ready, with a 40mm gun that had already been present on the unfinished V4 tank. By early 1944, 80 Toldi 2s, with their more reliable torsion bars, were upgunned, creating the Toldi 2A, or Toldi B/40, which would serve in the reconnaissance platoons of both armored divisions and the cavalry division's armored battalion. In April 1944, when the Hungarian army mobilized once again, 176 Toldis were available, fulfilling the requirements of the 1943 Szabolcs Plan. By that time, production had ceased, as the army was trying to obtain heavier models with better protection and greater firepower. They would see combat with the armored divisions in Galicia and southern Transylvania, and in Poland, where the 1st Cavalry Division was trying to stop the Soviet advance. In June, 66 Toldi 1 and 63 Toldi 2A light tanks remained operational, but these numbers would drop to near zero by the end of the year as losses mounted. In December, 2nd Armored had only 5 combat-ready Toldi 2A tanks, with another 16 that were repairable. Back in 1942, guns produced 2 prototypes with an improved 35mm front armor using the same 40mm gun and a longer turret. The company was ready to build 40 such vehicles, but the army ordered only 12 due to foreseeable issues with the engine and overall weight. Only 3 were finished by 1944, with no records of them ever seeing action. We should mention that in the meantime, 13 Toldi tanks were converted into field ambulances with less ammunition to make room for the wounded that could be brought back this way. Attempts were also made by Gans to build a tank hunter version along the lines of the German Marder II, which was being tested by the Hungarians in late 1943. A single Toldi was converted, borrowing the Marder's Pak-40 gun, but this was too heavy for the engine and still weakly protected, so the model was rejected and never saw actual combat. As the remaining Hungarian divisions retreated into Slovakia and Austria, most tanks were abandoned due to a lack of fuel and maintenance. At the end of the war, the Red Army captured the remaining Toldis and shipped them to the Soviet Union for testing. A single tank of each version remains today in the Kubinka Tank Museum, along with two other Hungarian models. Although the German allies called it Paper Panzer, the Toldi was adequate in its intended role, which is why it was never abandoned.